Born and raised among trees and wolves, Laegon is an elven archer. Like any woodland elf, he looks at events with the extreme neutrality of the natural world. His ability with the bow is incredible, being able to knock 2 arrows at the same time, but he is also at home with his trusty sword. As he walks the path of nature, Laegon is completely uninterested in chaos or law, living and fighting to protect and preserve the balance of nature, sometimes calling upon natural allies to aid him in his quest. Hello everybody and welcome to part 4 of my painting tutorials for the game Sword and Sorcery. Today I'll show you how I paint Laegon the Elf. I'll be using quite a few contrast paints in this video, so I've chosen Wraithbone as my undercoat. Wraithbone is specifically designed to be used with contrast paints. I'll get this tree hog undercoated and then I'll be right back once the paint is dry. Let's paint. Alright, for my first magic trick I'll base coat the skin of this miniature, and I'm using Rakarth flesh. I'm taking 1 drop of paint to 2 drops of water. And as always, 2 thin coats are better than 1 thick one. The reason I'm using Rakarth flesh is because I want it to look a bit pale. It is an elf after all. Following that, I'll add a shade of Raglan Flesh Shade. Following that, I'll add a layer of Flayed One Flesh. Applied everywhere except the recesses. And lastly, I'll add a highlight of Pallid Witch flesh. The next step is to paint his cape, his wrist armor and his centered cloth piece. And I'm going to use a contrast paint for this, namely Caranda's Green. I'm going to thin it down with some contrast medium. So I'll add it 1 layer at a time and go on from there. I'm using a 1-to-1 mix here. Here we go. The contrast paint is completely dry and it sure looks green right now. The next step is to add a layer, and I'm using Mood Green. And I'll apply this as a glaze. So only on the raised areas, like here. Then I'm going to quickly rinse my brush and then blend in the sides. Like so. Now we're just going to do this all over. The Mood Green is dry, and as you can see it has added some subtle highlights. Lastly, I would like to add some edge highlights using a dry paint. This time I'm using Underhive Ash. Just gently dry brush it across the edges. And now his cape is complete, at least for now. The next thing I want to paint is the remaining cloth, right here. And I'm going to use a contrast paint yet again, this time Achillean green. This time I'm taking it straight from the pot. Just apply it all over, but be careful not to hit any of the green parts. The contrast paint has been applied, so now it's time to add a layer, and I'm using Temple Guard Blue. You can almost use the contrast paint as a guide as to where to put the paint. You can see the lighter areas is where you want to put the layer. Just avoid all the recesses. Following that, I'll add a highlight of Baharoth Blue. The next thing I want to paint is his hair, and I want it to be white. So I'm starting with a base coat of grey cere. Grey cere is also good for contrast paints, which we are going to use in a minute. The grey cere base has been applied, so now it's time for a contrast, and I'm using Apothecary White. Just apply it all over, but be careful not to hit the places you've already painted. The contrast paint has fully dried and his hair looks, well, grey. So now I'm going to add a glaze of white scar. If you wish, you can use a dry brush of Praxetti White instead, but I prefer using white scar for this stage at least. The hair is complete, so the next thing I'm going to focus on is his leather suit, his boot and his quiver. And I'm using a base coat of Fundia Brown. You might need several layers for this. Following that base coat, I'll add a shade of Agrath Earthshade. The next step is to add a layer of Doombull Brown. Just avoid all the recesses. So I'm still at the same stage. I just decided to switch to a smaller brush. I'm using my Insane Detail brush now because there are so many, well, details on his suit. And finally, still using my Insane Detail brush, I'll add a highlight of Tuskor Fur. The elf has a belt running across his waist. I'm going to paint that with a contrast paint. And I'm using Black Legion. The Black Legion is dry, so now I'll add a highlight of Eshing Grey. Just follow along the edges. The next step is to paint all the metal, and here I'm talking about his shoulder pads and the sword he's keeping behind his cape. I'm starting with a base coat of lead belcher. Just take your time and be sure not to hit any of the areas you've already painted. Now, I must admit I switched to an insane detail brush when it came to painting the handles. Next up is a shade, and I'm using Coelia Green Shade. Next, I'll finish the metal by adding a highlight of Stormhost Silver. Next up, it's time for the bow and arrows, and I'm starting with a base coat of Grey Seer. Following that, I'll add a contrast paint, this time with the Skeleton Horde. Just apply it all over, but be careful not to hit the areas you've already painted. Following that, I would like to paint the arrow feathers and highlight the bow with Screaming Skull. Next up is the rock he's standing on, and I'm starting with the base coat of Stormvermin Fur. When the base coat is dry, I'll add a shade of Neon Oil. I've given the shade plenty of time to dry, so now I'll very carefully add a dry brush of Longbeard Grey. And with that dry brush, the model is complete. Of course, I need the base, but I'll paint it in exactly the same way as I did the other miniatures in this series. So, thank you for watching. If you like this, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.